Continuing coverage of the U.S. Supreme Court and decisions shaping our nation. Some major decision on President Trump's attempts to end birthright citizenship and the rights of transgender athletes. Live to CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson. So Jessica, let's start with birthright citizenship. Justice Alito really seems to feel pretty angry about this decision. Walk us through the ruling.
I think that's right. So this ruling was frankly closer than I had predicted, but a majority of the court did say that President Trump's attempt to redefine birthright citizenship by executive order is improper. Now, the breakdown changes depending on, is it improper under the Constitution or is it improper under a congressional statute that essentially codified the Constitution? We do have a bare majority of the Supreme Court saying, I'm looking at the 14th Amendment. Again, that was ratified after the Civil War. I'm looking at that clause, the birthright citizenship clause, and I understand it to mean if you were born on U.S. soil, we don't look to see, are your parents legal or illegal immigrants? We don't look to see if your parents are here temporarily or permanently. We look to see if you were born on U.S. soil, period. Now, when it comes to where the court had a little bit more consensus, 6-3, what they said is there was a statute that, again, basically mirrored the Constitution. And the court felt that that had essentially said the same thing. And so the only question, I think, the only reason that might matter is, can Congress pass a statute that looks like the president's executive order? And the answer is no, again, because even though it was a bare majority, the Supreme Court said this is a constitutional question. Read, as you know, there's two ways to change the Constitution or our understanding of it: constitutional amendment or a decision by the Supreme Court overturning a previous case.
When you think about some of the questions that were asked in the lead up to this by the justices, are you surprised, Jessica, by any of their positions?
So I have to admit, because there are recordings of you and I talking about this, that it was closer than I thought. I said, I think 7-2. I said, I think maybe even 8-0. But this was a case, this was an issue that the court struggled with a little bit more closely than I had anticipated. And obviously, it doesn't change the ultimate outcome, but I think that it's so hard, frankly, Reed. I mean, I'm going to pause here and just say it's so hard to predict based on oral arguments, right? Because the justices do what good judges are supposed to do. They play devil's advocate. They try and test their theories. And let's remember, they're advocating their position for their colleagues as well. This is the first time they sit down, and even though it's in front of all of us and we can all listen in, it's the first time they're talking about these cases.
Okay, so let's talk about the other major ruling. It upholds states' bans on transgender athletes in women's and girls' school sports. What did the court rule here, and do you see anything as undecided and yet to come up the legal pipeline to the Supreme Court?
So I'll take the second part first, which is the undecided part is essentially whether or not states can allow transgender athletes to participate on girls and women's sports teams. The court drops a footnote, I think it's the first footnote, that says those issues are working their way through the system and we're not weighing in on that today. Well, the court said is exactly what you said, Reed, which is that they looked at the Equal Protection Clause, again, another part of the 14th Amendment now we're talking about. They also looked at that landmark piece of federal legislation, Title IX, and they found that states do, in fact, have the power to say that girls' sports means people who are born as girls, who are biologically girls. And this is not a surprise from the court. The interesting part was the breakdown of the voting, where on the Equal Protection Clause issue, you did have a majority of the court, but it was a much slimmer majority than on the Title IX question. One thing to note, I think, moving forward is the court really confined themselves to youth sports and said this is not about employment, it's not about other situations. It's just confined to this area.
All right, so finally, the High Court also struck down federal limits on campaign financing. So will we see any impact from that on the coming midterms?
I think we could. So, in fact, when it comes to this campaign finance case, and I started my career as a campaign finance attorney, what should we look to? What we should look to is, I think this will increase the power of political parties. The court essentially struck down a federal law that prohibited or severely limited political parties from coordinating with candidates. And what the court has said essentially since 2010 in Citizens United is that outside groups, corporations, labor unions, individuals, when they make independent expenditures, those are unlimited. So outside groups got all of this additional power, somewhat to the detriment of political parties. I think that will even it out a bit. Political parties will regain some ground. But of course, this means for a lot of campaign finance reformers, additional influence of money in politics.
So, Jessica Levinson, if you look behind you, we have a birthday cake coming in the room. Right? Oh, I made you look. I'm kidding, but it is Jessica's birthday, and we do want to wish you a happy birthday. And I promise, when I see you in person, I'll make sure you get that birthday cake. Jessica Levinson, so great to see you, friend. Have a good one and a happy one.
Thank you.
So what does the president have to say about the high court's decisions? Live to CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang following reaction from the White House. Weijia, you hearing anything there?
Reed, President Trump has been very vocal this morning, posting about all the decisions. And as you can imagine, he is not happy about the birthright citizenship ruling because it was on day one of his second term that he signed an executive order trying to change the law. He says here the Supreme Court upheld birthright citizenship, which is too bad for our country. But then he goes on to say that he will try to change the law through legislation, through Congress. He says he would be very supportive of that. This is not an issue that lawmakers have really talked about publicly because it has been such a legal precedent in the Constitution, and whether or not, there are any sponsors of such bill, is TBD, but that is certainly what the president is pushing for. He also posted about 2 wins that Jessica just went over, starting with the ban on transgender athletes, although we should point out that the president kind of oversold the decision. You can see here he wrote, "Big win, the U.S. Supreme Court just ruled against men playing in women's sports." Wow. That's not exactly what happened. What we do know is that the states that currently ban transgender athletes can uphold those decisions, but there's still a question of other states, and it is up to those states. To be clear, there is not a federal ban on transgender athletes, Reed.
I think that's such important context, and thank you so much for adding that. So let's sort of pull the lens out and think about this Supreme Court term. What will history say about this term specifically as it relates to the president? Because he's had some big losses, also had some wins.
Reed, I think the bottom line is this is a blockbuster term for the presidency, because typically Supreme Court justices don't take up so many cases that will directly impact the president's agenda. And it wasn't just from the huge rulings that we saw in the first, in yesterday and today, but we have seen others as well. And I would say potentially one of the biggest rulings has been the tariffs case, because obviously that was such a center point of the president's economic plan, and in many ways with regard to his foreign policy as well. And after the Supreme Court struck that down, it was a big loss for the president's plan. Of course, he would just say that he is using other means to put penalties on other countries. And then the president himself just pointed out what is a pretty big win for him, and that is the ruling about his power to fire heads of independent agencies like the Federal Trade Commission. Of course, the caveat there is that the Federal Reserve Board was not included in that decision, and in fact, in a separate ruling, said the president could not move forward with that firing of a board member because, that board has such an impact on the nation's financial system. But the fact that he can decide, who leads other independent agencies, when historically many of those have been bipartisan, that is a big deal for the president. And he just posted about this actually a few minutes ago, saying that the biggest and most consequential decision issued by the court by far is the Slaughter case which is the one that allows him to determine who should and should not, have their jobs in those top agencies. So, Reed, I think it's a mixed bag in terms of wins and losses for the president. There have been several in each column. So it has been a historic term, to say the least, for this administration.
For sure. Weijia Jiang, thank you. Always great to talk to you. Have a good day.